basically welcome on the conversation. My first question really is sort of what made you such a strong advocate for reforming drug laws? I mean, obviously there's the new book I've seen in terms of a lot of the stuff that you've done in terms of, writing about drug laws and stuff. And then, why did you then go and decide to publish a book on the issue?
I mean, to be honest, I let my reporting and the facts pretty much do the talking. The book's more like a history of drug policy and an appraisal of the different models that are in place, like contemporaneously and historically. But yeah, like drugs have obviously affected my life tremendously, including through serious addiction in my family. So simply seeing and chatting with people who have dependencies on the streets, living in Bethnal Green, growing up in Bletchley. And yeah, these people, lovely souls, many, all of them, but seemingly receiving little useful help. And yeah, I've had my own kind of issues with alcohol and drugs, like nothing approaching dependency, but definitely some significant issues. Although, yeah, with drugs, yeah, my experiences have actually been, largely positive, but, have also ended up in some pretty difficult places. So I think there's a lack of, education about drugs and alcohol, along with practical help throughout society, in the UK. But yeah, ultimately, I was approached by the publisher because of my reporting on drug policy. And yeah, my wish is that, it's an objective, balanced book that, helps raise awareness of the awful situation that many people around the world still find themselves in. Persecuted for, trafficking, using drugs. And, it's almost always people that are marginalized that really feel the brunt of these regressive policies. So yeah, I'm happy with the book though. It's a kind of poppy product. It's not like a big tome. It's about 20,000 words, but it's got about 150 photos. The publishers did an amazing job putting it together. It's great little thing for the coffee table. And yeah, I guess I hope this podcast leads to a commission for my magnus opus, or is it magnum opus?
Well, maybe. So in terms of sort of drug policy then, in terms of where we go next, in terms, the UK at the moment seems to have actually published a report which almost leads to a sort of decriminalization in an interesting way. But I was wondering whether you were more in favor of sort of legalization of some drugs, decriminalization as they have in Portugal, which is more focused on removing laws for sort of carrying small quantities and trying to get people out of drug addiction. So I was wondering whether you have any sort of preference towards either of those, or whether there's another way that you think we can do it.
Yes, it's interesting. I woke up this morning and checked Twitter and spoke with a friend, and yeah, the government have released this white paper today. So it's just sort of putting a small flag in the sand, right? A lot can happen from here, but yeah, it clearly signals a continued shift away from imprisonment and a kind of blanket criminalized approach, despite some fundamentally regressive elements like drug testing people to make sure they're staying abstinent according to like the terms of a court order. But the government seem to be catching up with the number of police forces that have introduced kind of various decriminalization models for certain possession and use offences across the UK. 6, 7 or 8 police forces. Durham led the way, and it seems like these policies are appear to be bearing fruit. And obviously, if you're not locking people up, it's going to reduce the rate of people in and out of prison. And many people are coming around to the reality that prison is often a kind of crime school. And there's other promising projects underway, state provided heroin-assisted treatment in Middlesbrough. Bristol, first long-time license for a service to test the purity of drugs and deliver harm reduction was recently announced. So yeah, there's plenty of movement, but the two main parties don't really consider it, a vote winner. I mentioned this the other day. It brings me back to this idea of this Gramscian idea of passive revolution, where political change is kind of veiled in doublespeak and kind of relatively unannounced. Even when it's significant, but it's so gradual and slow that it's quite difficult for the average person to kind of identify. But I guess on the wider point, about legalization and decriminalization, it's not just in the UK where in the political sphere and the public sphere, drug policy is increasingly being seen as a health and not criminal issue. Even though on this white paper it's still going to be kind of like these special courts, and it's it's still a kind of criminal justice approach. It just adds more barriers to someone going to prison, and follows the trend that's been in place for a while. I think about 500 first offenders were imprisoned in 2020, which is still a significant number, but it's a massive fall. But yeah, in Portugal, as I'm sure the death and HIV infection rate fell very swiftly when drugs were decriminalized and treatment provision was massively expanded. In 2001, the outreach work is really bold. I've seen photos of these kind of aquatic exercises for people in treatment that look thoroughly relaxing. And yeah, people are going to marginalized parts of the country to offer help. But I think the architects of the plan, said that the main thing is removing the stigma. So, when you do that, people aren't afraid to ask for help. If there is an overdose, in a place where people are using drugs, they can call the ambulance, and it's probably likely that the cops aren't going to come unless there's some kind of wider crime that they're investigating. But yeah, decriminalization doesn't solve the issue of the market, and there's kind of widespread concerns that authority figures in Portugal, kind of in the police and the military, are involved in to some degree with the drug trade, because there's still that demand, and decriminalization just doesn't take the billions out of the hands of the criminals.
Yeah, so I mean, sort of to ask almost the opposite question, why then do you think that drugs being illegal and the so-called sort of war on drugs, why do you think that failed, and why do you think sort of keeping drugs illegal is not the right route?
I think historically, humans and indeed some other animals have got a kind of insatiable desire to explore altered states of consciousness. And when cannabis, mushrooms, opium, coca grow so abundantly all over the world, then you can't make something illegal and expect that to stop people experimenting, working, and abusing these plants, unless you've got like a totally kind of authoritarian approach, as in somewhere like the Philippines and other countries in Southeast Asia. But still people still use drugs there. Yeah, I think in a nutshell that's the answer to the question. Just like wheat that's used in alcohol, you can't alter human nature with mere laws.
So something else actually you wrote about last year was drug consumption rooms, which goes more along the lines of ensuring that people do use drugs, then it's safely. And it's taken off quite a lot in Scotland, but I think it still has quite a way to go in England to pick up that sort of popular support. This is a policy that really should be up and running in as many areas as possible. So do you think there's a way we can speed it up, and why do you think that drug consumption rooms are so important?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think the situation is more acute in Scotland. You know, drug death rates are the highest in Europe by quite some distance. And with respect to you know, some of my friends, the campaigning in England has been comparatively mild, you know, given that the activist Peter Crichton set up an arguably illegal, you know, supervised drug consumption ban, you know, right on the streets of Glasgow. But look, you know, it's obviously a desperately needed service, and you know, he demonstrated the political point with you know, incredible bravery, and you know, it seems that a bid now to install these kind of permanent facilities in 3 Scottish cities is going to be accepted, because yeah, the issue just became so serious that the governing Scottish National Party kind of simply had to hold up their progressive credentials on the one hand. You know, I'm sure it also came from a good place, but I think they're in a very difficult situation. And it's a good issue for them because drug policy is not devolved, and Westminster ultimately has the power. And I think the Daily Record, you know, got on board in a way that, you know, the newspapers in England haven't, regarding kind of, you know, significant drug policy reform. The Times put out an editorial once, very strong stance they took, but I don't think it's been so sustained. You know, from an editorial perspective, obviously, you know, newspapers across the board, you know, have covered some really important issues on drug policy very well, but there hasn't been that same sustained kind of editorial stance, you know, that the Daily Record, you know, took. But you know, there is pressure for drug consumption rooms in England from, you know, significant quarters. 13 MPs and I think 7 police and crime commissioners wrote to the then Home Secretary in 2019 a letter I covered for The Guardian, you know, calling for them, saying the international evidence is clear. You know, I think there's about 100 of these drug consumption rooms around the world, 16 or so countries, you know, thousands of you know, injections and drug uses have been recorded and observed and supervised, and there's never been a recorded death because, you know, if you do have supervision, someone has the overdose antidote, naloxone, and simply, you know, if the person's throwing up, they just make sure they don't, you know, choke on their own vomit. So yeah, it seems the evidence is clear. I visited a facility in Denmark, yeah, for The Guardian in 2018, and yeah, we did a very interesting piece covering the, you know, amazing work that they're doing there. But yeah, it seems that it's a bit of a step too far, I think, at the moment for the authorities in England, even though we have these heroin-assisted treatment, you know, facilities. Yeah, I don't know. Baby steps. There was a Public Health England report a year or two ago, and in the first version that they published, you know, it was a bit more sympathetic towards DCRs, but then it got taken down and put up again a few weeks later, you know, a bit toned down. You know, it's just difficult when you know, the standard of evidence that, you know, you need, you know, for certain policy changes, and especially when the bar seems to be much higher on controversial issues, like, it's difficult to do some of this research to, the highest standard, possible when there's no funding, partly because there's no profit motive. So these charities are kind of doing it on a bootstrap. And yeah, it seems to me that the accumulation of evidence is very, very impressive.
So for the last bit, I'm just going to move on to sort of drug use for medical purposes, because that's also been something in, especially England, that's been a very large and sort of long-standing debate. And one of the things relatively recently has been the debate about medical cannabis. So originally it was available on prescription, and it was sort of seen as a very big win. And then after that, it's turned out to be very, very difficult for people to access that. I know, especially with sort of epilepsy, it's been very difficult for families to actually get hold of medical cannabis. So do you think that might have actually, in some ways, been more of a political stunt than it was necessarily a sort of major change? And how easy would it be to actually make that more accessible?
Yeah, I mean, certainly, I think medical cannabis was legalized to kind of kill the story that was getting, increasingly embarrassing to the government. Billy Caldwell was in hospital after his medicine was confiscated, and yeah, it was a very effective piece of campaigning that illustrated, yeah, kind of how archaic in a way the drug laws were on that specific case. Like, who could deny a 8-year-old boy who's having dozens of serious seizures every day unless he has a couple of drops of cannabis that doesn't even really, like, I mean, maybe he'll be a little bit high, but it's not like he's not like he's walking down the street of Kingston, Jamaica with a big doobie in his mouth. And even if he was, like, so long as he's not harming anyone else, and the cannabis has hopefully come from an ethical source, then what difference does it make to the vast majority of people's lives? But I guess what's happened is that no new NHS prescriptions have been given since this legalization. A couple had been previously on kind of a compassionate, really exceptional basis. But yeah, the thing is that about 10,000 prescriptions in total. I'm sure that some people have had more than one prescription have been issued privately since November 2018, according to one campaigner. And there's about 15 clinics growing around the country to supply the demand. Police chiefs support this CAN card scheme used by about 50,000 people to ensure that medical users are entitled to even carry legal market cannabis. And yeah, but privately, you can get like a month's supply for about 300 quid. It's just for the specialist oils that the epileptic children need. It's obviously way more. So it's a really difficult situation for them. Like, the idea that they're being legalized, I presume, wasn't, just to, give more business to private clinics. It was, to put it through the NHS, because, most families, can't afford, to spend a few £1,000s a month, even £300 a month, especially considering that, their added outgoings, for having a child, with such a serious disability. And I think what it is like a combination of these rigid guidelines set by the healthcare watchdog NICE and the kind of British Pediatric Neurological Association, not really supporting it. And, there's rumors of doctors, coming under pressure, and a lot of these guys and women, in these positions, will have also been there 20 years ago when these kind of reefer madness, narratives weren't as kind of challenged, as they are being, quite convincingly today. So yeah, I feel like there remains like a lot of resistance in the medical establishment, but as the evidence continues to grow, and even if it is anecdotal, I feel like the kind of adherence to these kinds of tropes and views are going to continue to wilt.
So my final question actually is sort of carrying on with that theme of looking at using drugs more for medical use. And one of the other ones has been psychedelics being used for treatment of stuff like post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. And even that, there's kind of been this unwillingness and pushback on actually using it simply because it is seen as a drug. And that one I found surprising just because of the fact that, given the fact that it often ends up getting used on people who are sort of ex-military and so on as well, it's almost surprising that it would get pushback. So, how do we kind of get past that resistance? Because it's strange, I think, to even see it there.
Yes, I mean, for me, it's quite remarkable. Some of these arguments, saying, well, use another drug to treat addiction or these sorts of things. I mean, morphine is a drug. Antidepressants are drugs. All of these pills that are prescribed are also consciousness alterants. But yeah, veterans are at the front line of the changes in the US, and I understand that within 24 months, it's expected that MDMA and psilocybin will be, approved by the FDA for PTSD and depression, respectively. And yeah, I guess a classic kind of countercultural refrain has been that perhaps psychedelics were prohibited because the US establishment and others around the world who followed in tandem were afraid that they might cause people to become more rebellious and thus increase pressure on the status quo to make some changes. I feel maybe it's not as clear cut as that. I think it's more that President Nixon who declared the war on drugs, the hippies. The nascent hippie movement then was very anti-Vietnam War, and especially at that time, the idea that you would recreatively take something that could in some cases send you pretty loopy, but obviously the vast majority of usages responsible. Maybe it didn't seem so at the time, but I'd be surprised if most people were just taking them like lunatics. I mean, it is possible, but yeah, I think he was just seeking to crush opposition to the Vietnam War, and it was a good stick to beat them with. So it's kind of collateral damage in a way, and also, and this is the same thing today as regulators kind of grapple, with these questions like. Psychedelics don't kind of fit into this allopathic pharmaceutical model. They will need to come alongside, therapy, preparation before, integration afterwards, and nor does their kind of seemingly manifold, benefits fit into this kind of rationalist, worldview that's kind of often tinged by a kind of disconnection with nature, and a skepticism of the, potentially healing power of, simple plants, and the knowledge of indigenous cultures. I think we in the West have, become very ostracized from, if ever we were more connected, with them in some ways, perhaps through our own. Traditions, but these kind of medicine people were also, persecuted through the witch hunts, the Inquisition, the Roman attacks on the Druids. But yeah, I think it's a positive moment, though. Research has been unshackled. Still now, like, skeptics justifiably point to the fact that most of the research on each specific drug is only kind of tested hundreds of people, not thousands. And yeah, I think that's a significant point, also explained by the fact that big pharma hasn't got behind it, so it's mainly kind of smaller organizations that are funding these studies. So that does explain the scope of them to some extent. That I think there are questions for other organizations to answer on some of the sizes of the studies. But look, these drugs, or plants, carry, I think, great potential for healing, and it's not a minute overdue in this kind of mental health crisis, and the growing realization that some of our current drugs, that are widely prescribed, aren't fit for purpose. And nothing really survives, I think, in human consciousness for this long if it was useless. With regards to some of these plant medicines, psychedelics, that have been used for thousands of years. And today, yeah, all sorts of people are using psychedelics. Chris Martin, was coming out saying that, the Coldplay frontman, that helped him reconcile his view on the world. Like Justin Bieber's wearing like shroomy necklaces, like, as well. Other pop stars like Jaden Smith is saying how amazing everything is on magic mushrooms. Like half of Hollywood have done ayahuasca and DMT. There's this Michael Pollan Netflix series out at the moment. Like, it's difficult to keep up with it, really. It's literally only over the last 3 or 4 years, just the Overton window has really shifted, in step with some of the research, which has been very impressive, and these stories of people like the veterans, who had crippling PTSD, and now suddenly can, enjoy their lives. They still face challenges, but they're not experiencing these really, really crippling and destructive symptoms. It seems to me, as people will find out on this Netflix documentary, I haven't watched it yet, but psychedelics, can really go to the root of people's trauma and suffering in a way that I don't think current Western medicines can. People can undergo therapy and do different forms of meditation and exercise, but you can really take a shortcut with these psychedelics, and then these other practices can help people integrate their experiences. So yeah, I feel like the question really now is access and method of delivery, because currently psychedelic therapy is basically, where it's permitted, it's generally the preserve of wealthy Westerners. And yeah, I think that's a shame. Obviously, there's economic factors, and if there's not state support, for these treatments, then that will continue. It seems like in Oregon, which is rolling out psilocybin therapy next year, that there may be some spots for people on low incomes, but broadly speaking, in keeping with the US healthcare model, it's going to be paid for, and whether people's insurance packages cover it remains to be seen. I think it will take some time.
Well, thank you for that answer, and also just thank you for coming on the conversation. Yeah, no, thank you for having me on. It's been good to chat with you, and yeah, we're in a really interesting moment right now. I think
I think, as I say, like 3 years ago when I was approached to do this book, like it was, you know, still in some aspects a kind of taboo topic, you know, legalizing drugs. And look, I think, you know, we shouldn't rush to do, you know, anything, and everything has to be, you know, very carefully, you know, considered. And, you know, I think, you know, significant safeguards, you know, need to be in place. You know, I don't think we should have, you know, a retail market for all drugs. And indeed, I think that, you know, the safeguards on alcohol use should be much stronger, you know, such as in places like Quebec in Canada, where, you know, spirits are only sold in a small number of government stores that are only open between certain times. But, you know, I think we should go even further than that. And, you know, there should be far more readily available, you know, treatment and harm reduction advice, for alcohol, you know, and drugs, you know, as soon as possible, because people just don't have the information, you know, whether they're legal or illegal. And, you know, I think that's a terrible shame. And that's, you know, that lack of information, that lack of education, you know, is in large part, you know, driving a lot of this, along with, you know, other factors.
Very much. So yeah, I mean, it's true. I mean, I honestly think at the moment that kind of feels like the end of the Netflix series. Actually, it's sort of a similar. But their thing is we should not take drugs seriously, but effectively go. You know, it is if you legalize them and all the rest of it. It's the biggest thing is to make sure that it isn't just used as much as a recreational thing, which seems to be the phrase now. But the ending is like, you know, using it for some kind of purpose, because of most of it's going around and looking at, you know, Native Americans and how they use drugs, and you know, how it's used in therapy and so on. So it feels very similar to that in the sense of, you know, yes, it can be legalized and stuff, but it's always good to actually have, you know, purposes that actually it is good for, as well as just, you know, simply go, oh, okay, it's legal now.
Yes, I mean, you know, when the West first discovered tobacco, you know, these chaps in these Native American, you know, communities weren't walking around chain smoking. They were, you know, it was the ceremonial use of tobacco in, you know, relatively limited amount of occasions. So I think there's a lot we can learn. Also, you know, for the use of alcohol, and, you know, we need to be careful. Like, you know, just look at the opioid crisis in the US. Pharmaceutical companies, you know, had carte blanche to, you know, sell these addictive painkillers, you know, through pharmacies across the country. And, you know, look what's happening now. And, you know, some of these drugs, you know, that are currently illegal, you know, might even be more addictive, you know, than opioids. So yeah, look, we need to be careful. But this isn't an argument not to change things, because I think it's, you know, even more dangerous to just uphold the status quo.
Very much so. Well, I think we can leave it there, unless there's anything else you want to say, sort of on the end. But
no, I think that's a good way to round it off. You know, as I say, I just you know, I just want to let, you know, the facts do the talking. And, you know, if I can be a medium for some of those on both sides, you know, some of the issues that are also arising regarding the use of drugs in therapy and elsewhere, then, you know, I'm, you know, happy to be that messenger, you know, from an unbiased perspective.
Brilliant. Well, as I said, thank you for coming on, and it's been great to chat to you.
Cheers. Thanks, Torrin.